Yeah, welcome everyone, and thank you to Grace and London Funders for their support for UK grant making. This is our first presentation this year on UK grant making. It literally just launched yesterday, so all of this is very fresh. Just going to share my screen. Right. I've had a look at the list of participants, and it looks like the majority of people here are actually from organisations that publish their data using the 360 Giving data standard. So I'm going to assume that I don't need to do a full introduction to 360 Giving, but the top line for people who don't know is that 360 Giving was founded in 2015 to support grant makers to publish their data using the 360 Giving data standard. And our aim is for more money to go to where it's needed most, through a more informed understanding of the grant making picture. So we help people to access and use the data, and have created tools to make it easy to explore, download and visualize. So we're still quite a small charity with only 6 permanent members of staff, but we work with over 320 of the leading grant makers who've published over 1 million grants, worth over £300 billion. And over 100,000 people a year access the data in our tools, including in our search engine for grants called GrantNav. We've got a free workshop, which is an introduction to GrantNav, coming up on the 25th of June for anyone who wants to know more about exploring the data. But we've also got introduction to publishing workshops coming up, if you are interested in sharing your data, if you've been inspired by what you see today. And I am going to focus on UK grant making today, but obviously happy to explore any other questions a bit later. So UK grant making, as Grace said, this is the second year. And for us, it was really important to look at how we could put the wider data into context. And it's quite a difficult session for a presentation, because actually the data is better explored directly on the platform than described and talked about. So I won't be at all offended if you want to have a play with the data while I'm speaking. In fact, I actually recommend it. Ruth is going to be putting relevant links into the chat as we go along. Feel free to have a play. Over to Emily.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily. I'm the interim deputy CEO at 360 Giving, and I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction to UK grant making. So UK grant making is the definitive annual publication on grant funding in the UK. We launched the second edition yesterday, which found that over 14,000 grant makers gave over £23 billion in 2023 to 24. It's a free interactive platform that shares data across all funding sectors. So looking at government, trusts and foundations, national lottery distributors, donor advised funds and charities. UK grant making is very generously supported by Pears Foundation and CCLA, and it's a partnership between 360 Giving, the Association for Charitable Foundations, the Association for Charitable Organisations, UK Community Foundations and London Funders. We wanted to, when we set out to create UK grant making, we wanted to really build on previous work by Pears Foundation and ACF on foundation giving trends, but also expand it to look at all funding sectors, not just trusts and foundations, and to look at where the money is going to, as well as who it's from. So we do use 360 Giving data to look at grant recipients, and we use regulator data, published accounts and other sources to support filling in the gaps in the amounts awarded and distributed outside of 360 Giving data. Our intention is that this is something that will really grow and develop with each edition. So we're wanting to really be able to look at different themes and areas as we kind of evolve UK grant making. Can we go to the next slide, Tanya? Thank you. So it's important to note that we could only create UK grant making because of all of the investment that actually came before into 360 Giving to get us where we are now. So we wouldn't be able to do it without the over 300 funders who share their data using the 360 Giving standard. And as Tanya mentioned, I know many of you are in the room today. And also the investment that has been made by other funders over the last decade. And while these funders haven't funded UK grant making specifically, other than Pears Foundation, it really wouldn't have been possible without everything in place and the support for 360 Giving that has allowed us to really build the infrastructure and have the opportunity to grow and mature in what we're able to deliver, and be able to provide access to all of the data for free as well. And we have a really wide variety of funders that actually do publish their data, but also some that don't. And that does impact the overall picture of what we're able to understand around grant making. And we're going to explore that a little bit later when we come to look at some of the challenges and learning. Back to you, Tanya.
Thank you. So on to UK grant making, we identified just over 14,000 UK grant makers in the 23 to 24 financial year, which was what we were looking at, because that's when we had the most recent accounts available. And as this overall profile charts represents, we focused on capturing all of the grant makers across the different sectors. So as Emily said, we estimated that £23 billion worth of grants were provided to voluntary and community organisations, and that includes a little bit of our estimate of local authorities and devolved government grants, which are around £1 billion between them. So unfortunately, we weren't able to get figures on for the local government and for the devolved governments consistently from any sources, even through working with the Directorate of Social Change, who had actually done some FOIs to local authorities. It was really difficult to get some figures. So I think that's part of the overall context, that we have much better data in some areas than others. So the green circle on the right represents the government, includes central government departments, which all publish their data using 360Giving data standard, and arm's length bodies. And it would be even bigger if we had the devolved government in there as well. National lottery distributors, which is that blue dot at the top, is provided £2.4 billion worth of grants. And it's important to note that that's all of their money, not just all the grants they made, not just the grants that were from the lottery. The lottery distributors also distributed some government money as well. And next to it, on the other category here, we've got donor advised funds, and that dot, which you can't really see very clearly, is companies. So the donor advised funds provided grants to the value of £2.1 billion. And I think for us, that's been an area where there's been a big increase in recent years. I think it's quite interesting. And the companies in there, this excludes the corporate foundations, which you can see are in the trusts and foundations, but the companies here, Director of Social Change estimated to be about 324 million. And probably that's a slight overestimate because it includes all of their cash distributions and not just their grants. And then in purple at the bottom, we have the charities, which we define as organisations that make grants alongside other charitable services or are supporting a single organisation or network. And that small dot there is the NHS hospital foundations. So altogether, this charity bubble is 3.4 billion grants. And then the biggest one in orange is the grant makers category, which represents the vast majority in terms of the number of organisations. That's 91% in the profile. And it totals £8.2 billion in grants, which is 36% of the overall grant amount that was distributed. And for me, I think the interesting thing is that I think this is probably the first year where the trusts and foundations in orange and the donor advised funds in the red, which are broadly kind of philanthropic money, are larger than the government and the national lottery distributors, which are broadly institutional money. And obviously, the majority of the government funding is in the form of contracts. But I think it's interesting to see how things are shifting overall, and particularly because we saw trusts and foundations increase their grant making by 12% over the year and donor advised funds by 20%, and with the growth in terms of the lottery and the government, it's been fairly static over recent years. So I think the other context that it's important to note is that grant making is less than a quarter of the sector income overall. So even though there has been a 7% increase in grant making as a whole, that is only a portion of the sector's income. And I think it's important that we recognise this ecosystem of funding and funders to provide perspective on our own work, but also to understand that changes and trends in one area will have an impact on others, and to appreciate the potential opportunities of collaboration. So I think it's clear that no single funder or even subsector of funders can do it alone. So looking at foundations in more detail, since most of you are from foundations, we can see that family foundations provided 2.1 billion of grants, excluding Wellcome Trust, and 3.4, including Wellcome Trust. And the largest category of grant makers by number was the general grant makers, which is our catch-all category that represents the charity registered foundations that didn't meet the other criteria for the other segments in this chart. And we think there's over 11,000 of those grant makers that fell into the category, of which the vast majority are very small with limited information about them. Corporate foundations provided about £1 billion worth of grants, and fundraising foundations about 0.4 billion. I think interestingly, of those fundraising grant makers, 20 out of the 50 largest fundraising grant makers were postcode lottery distributors. So the People's Postcode Lottery has grown massively over recent years, and they contributed 204 million between them in 2023, and actually will have grown even more since then. So they're becoming collectively one of the largest grant makers. Membership and trade funded organisation segment includes benevolent funds, livery companies, and they're a similar size to the fundraising grant makers at 0.4 billion pounds. And then we have the community foundations at just under 200 million pounds of grants, and government and lottery endowed such as social investment, business and local trusts providing 128 million of grants. So altogether, when we look at the largest 300 grant makers across these segments, grant spending increased from the previous year by 16%. However, one of the things to highlight is that there are no consistent patterns or trends within segments. It's a really diverse sector, and even when we look at the largest 100 organisations, you can see here this is their change in grant making between the years, and coloured by their type. You can see that there were a number that increased a fair bit, a few that decreased, and generally the majority of the funders gave around a similar level as previous years. But even when you look at the ones that did increase significantly, or the ones that did decrease more significantly, they aren't of a consistent type. So you can see there is a kind of member trade funded, a family foundation, and we've got here a fundraising grant maker, and then a general grant maker. So it's a real mix in terms of what's been happening. We also looked at endowments. So we looked at the largest 100 endowments and gathered data over the 5 years. As there were some newly created organisations or newly donated endowments funds during the period, we considered the trends only for the organisations with an endowment over the whole 5-year period, which is 94 organisations. So if you look at the grey line, you can see that endowment levels have remained relatively flat in recent years, representing a decline in real terms since 2020 to 21, which is the dark grey line. I mean, it's marginally improved when you look at the orange lines at the top, which include Wellcome Trust, but not much. So in our financial year of 23 to 24, the value of endowments was £50 billion worth, of the largest endowments was £50 billion worth, excluding Wellcome Trust, and 83 billion including it. So when we look at these trends, though, in endowments, it should be noted that it isn't just about investment performance, but also reflects choices made by some foundations to distribute more of their endowment where they have a choice, or even to spend down. So there are a mixture of things that go into those figures, but I think it's an interesting trend overall. And then, so now we're looking at the data published using the 360Giving data standard, and rather than the regulator data that we were looking at before. So we focused on a narrower group of funders and considered where the money is going to. So we had data on 97,000 grants awarded in 23 to 24 to analyse. And after removing grants that were awarded to be re-granted to another organisation, we had a clearer picture of who the overall recipients of the grants were. Overall, where recipients of grants were charities, we can see that most of the grants were provided to small organisations, those with income under £1 million. And you can see that there's quite a significant difference across the different bands between the different types of funders. So you can see that the government funded more large organisations compared to community foundations and national lottery distributors, which included small organisations as well. And then, so looking at funders who provide grants to individuals and families, which is a feature that was developed in the 360Giving data standard a couple of years ago. From our research, we think there are there's about 4,000 grant makers in the UK who provide grants to individuals with a value of estimated to be £850 million. And of the data that has been published using the 360Giving data standard, which is obviously only a small portion of that, given that it's a relatively new feature, we can see that the majority of money, the majority of grants have gone into areas which are considered the most deprived wards in the UK. So this top bar are the most deprived wards, and the bottom is the least deprived. So I think that's also just an illustration of what can be done with the data. You can see in the platform there is a lot more on the grants to individuals, including the dimensions of those grants, the size of the grant, what they were for, to give a bit more of an understanding of that. And then looking at London, one of the issues we commonly see when people analyse the grants from GrantNav is that complaint that all the money is going into London. And as many of you know, we've been working on improving the geographical understanding of the data by adding a location scope category. So grants can be described as being local, regional, national, international. However, we wanted to see what might be possible in UK grant making to better understand the funded organisation using the external data from the Charity Commission. So what we did was we looked at the area of operation for charities registered in London, and our analysis shows that in the top bar of this chart, 56% of the number of grants that were provided to London registered charities were serving London only. And in the second bar, you can see that only 28% of the total amount of the grants awarded to London registered charities was given to those operating in London only. And so for me, that's really significantly different to the perceptions of grant making. Yes, there may be more organisations receiving grants who are based in London, but that doesn't necessarily mean the money is being spent in London. I think that's an important thing for us to understand. We hope this approach to analysing the data might provide some inspiration for those who are analysing grants geographically to explore the impact of national and international charities on the overall picture. And whilst this does have a disproportionate impact on London due to the higher number of national and international charities headquartered there, it does also affect other areas where it's harder to distinguish between local and regional organisations as well to understand the patterns of funding. I think one of the other things to consider is with the increase in organisations moving to remote working, the locations of the registered address companies further distorts the overall picture of where the grants are actually spent. This is looking at the recipient size of organisations that are both registered in London, and you can see again the organisations that were London only organisations in terms of their delivery and how their registration on the Charity Commission was are smaller than the overall profile of the organisations in London that were funded. And presented you with a few highlights from UK grant making. Across the platform, you're going to see many more, including commentary from our UK grant making partners. I think this is also another one where you can look at it specifically looking at this is London Funders members and where you have recipients in common. So the thicker the line, the more grant recipients the organisations have in common. And if you go onto the platform, you can actually click on the different lines to be able to see how many there are. And if those that are 360Giving publishers, we're able to provide you a bespoke report where you can have a look at that overlap in more detail. So do get in touch with us if you're interested to see a little bit more about that. But the reason why we show this is because I think it's really important for us to understand that bit around the ecosystem, that changes in a programme by one funder can easily have an impact, not just on the charities they fund, but also in terms of other funders and the balance of the different applications that might be being received. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context that this work happened in. I really hope that people spend time playing on the platform and exploring, and we'd love to get people's feedback so we can learn and adapt to future editions and look at what you might be interested in. We're definitely seeing this as something that will evolve and improve based on feedback and learning. One of the things that did come up is that there were a lot of gaps and inconsistencies in the data available. And that includes gaps in some funder types and most notably local authorities and devolved governments, where we weren't able to get the level of detail needed to be able to support the analysis, other than a few exceptions in London. But the lack of the local authority data is a real challenge, and it's impacting both our understanding of the funding picture, but also the ability to collaborate between local funders and make the most of the effective funds available. So 360Giving is going to be working on a pilot to support more local authorities to share their data and then to improve that overall picture. There are also challenges in terms of data quality and inconsistency in the data available between different regulators. For example, there was much more information available from the Charity Commission in England and Wales than there is from OSCA in Scotland, and also there's challenges on the size of the charities, particularly smaller charities. There's very little information about them if they are under the annual return threshold. There are also some funders that are not registered as independent charities, so it was also very difficult for us to get information from all of them as well. It was surprisingly difficult to work out who was an active grant maker. There are over 60,000 organisations that had marked on the Charity Commission register that they do grant making, nearly 19,000 who'd marked that it was their main way that they carried out their objects. We know that we will have missed some organisations, and we hope that with more feedback we can refine our data and approach. And related to this, there were also a number of trusts and foundations that had changed their legal form during this period, so such as registering as a CIO or had assets transferred for other reasons. So it's actually also quite difficult to match up records for different organisations. We found that there were organisations that didn't complete their annual returns correctly, and actually a surprising number of accounts that weren't SORT compliant. We did end up needing to manually look up, can't remember what the total was in the end, but a few thousand accounts to be able to check the data. And in some of those, it was quite difficult to make sure that we had accurate information about their grant making. And we are looking at ways that we can support improved data quality. And we're also in discussions with the Charity Commission about how we can support that. I mean, in particular, the categorisation. of charities on the register is a bit of a challenge and could be more useful. You'll be surprised at the number of charities that have ticked every single box on the Charity Commission register. And particularly when you look at children and young people coming up as the most common group served, I think that is a reflection both on grant making supporting children and young people, but also that it's a box that it's quite easy for everyone to tick. So understanding where it's what an organisation primarily does would be helpful. Another challenge was availability of the grants for deeper exploration. So I think that's something that we would want to encourage more organisations to publish their data so that we can support that understanding a little bit more about the recipients. In particular, there's different groups that we would like to work with. I mentioned the growth of the donor advised funds. We'd be keen to work with them to understand more about where their money is going to. And again, we don't necessarily need to know who the donor is. That can be done anonymously, but we do want to understand a bit more about what does that mean in terms of the grant making picture. There's also the geographical limitations. So you'll see in the London section, we explored the geographical dimension to look at national and international charities. But there's a broader question of improving our understanding of where projects are delivered rather than where the recipient organisation is based. And it's definitely something that we want to do a little bit more work on. But I'd say it isn't all doom and gloom. We've actually learned a lot from the process. It improved significantly from last year, and we made lots of amends both in terms of the data and the platform based on feedback. And in particular, some of you will have seen we've got a new blog section, so we've got more narrative to respond to people's interest in having a bit more of a deep dive and understanding on specific issues and more commentary from partners. And so how can you use UK grant making? There's a mixture of ways that you can use it. The other thing just to mention is that we actually have the full data set is available on all of those grant makers in the methodology and data section. And if you are interested particularly if you're interested in identifying funders in a particular area, we have included on that the area of operation of the funders and also included on that where the funders are based. So you could identify organisations that might be operating in your area. But for us, there's a mixture of ways that it could be used, and we have seen it being increasing requests for benchmarking and other uses of the data, both in terms of funders understanding as well as for charities to understand that overall picture. We can also give you support with this, and you're welcome to book a one-to-one support call with Ruth to help you in terms of some of the options about how to go about that. This was a very quick whistle-stop tour of UK grant making, what you can do with the data, but it's really just the starting point. So do play with the data, book on a free workshop, book a one-to-one support call. If you're stuck for those they're available for anyone, so you don't have to be a 360Giving publisher to have one of those support calls. And we can also provide any bespoke training for your team or networks. But we'd also really welcome your feedback. So over to you. What are your reflections? How would you like to use the data? And what would you like to see in future editions?